Your first big film that you both wrote and directed was a super fun 80s creature feature, Critters 2. So tell us about making that film.
Well, I don't know if it's fair to call it a big film, but it was certainly a big opportunity for me, even though nobody saw it when it came out. But, it was a very small budget independent movie, a sequel to a ripoff of Gremlins that nobody expected a whole lot out of.
Those hungry hairballs from outer space are on a roll, and they'll eat anything.
It had everything that's difficult about making movies: kids, animals, locations, special effects, opticals, puppets, everything tough on a tight $4 million budget. Although we shot in LA, including a scene outside with a naked centerfold in 21 degree, well, let's see, in Celsius, but let's just say below zero temperature, weather that was not easy on anybody. It was really complicated, but it was also a great family, surrounded by a bunch of really creative people. Great. My director of photography went on to win the Oscar for Titanic. The makeup effects people were all great. The Kyoto brothers creating all the wonderful puppetry and effects, and the cast was so good. It was really a baptism by fire, but one that was incredibly pleasurable.
What do you think it is about creature features that people still love till this day?
Well, there's certainly the joy of embracing puppets or monsters or creatures. I think everybody has a monster inside them, and it's not necessarily an evil one, but certainly the idea of a fantastical creature, it's not real, but the what if gene starts kicking in, and the ability of just playing that game of what if there were hundreds of little furry space creatures running around and biting at your ankles or launching their quills at you. Just there's something a lot of fun. It's like taking the brakes off of a story. You're rolling downhill and a giant ball of 1,000 critters is rolling after you. And, it's the fear without the threat. You're going to get through this. You're watching it in a movie, but if we've done it well, you're caught up in it. And then you feel the exhilaration of the danger and the threat, but you come out of it safe.
You are kind of a master of Stephen King adaptations and doing them extremely well. So
Thank
what
you.
is it about King's work that intrigues you other than the obvious?
Well, what's great about King's work, aside from it being brilliant, is that it's also, and one of the things that makes it brilliant, is it's set in a very real world, even when it goes to unreal places, like in Sleepwalkers or many of his stories that have creatures or they go into fantastical worlds.
Was it Pennywise?
Big white guy, red nose, about 75 feet tall, mouth full of razor sharp teeth.
It feels very real. They're very character oriented. They're people I identify with. And he and I are of the same generation. He's a few years older than me, but where we have a lot of the cultural touchstones that were the same. We grew up on the same TV shows and movies and comic books and all those things. So, but there's a depth. There's, he's obviously a husband and father, and there's a depth to the people in his stories that feels genuine. There's a veracity about his characters that we can identify with. They shop at Walmart, they eat at McDonald's, they do the things that everybody does. And, one of my favorite themes in my own work and in the work with Stephen King is Norman Rockwell Goes to Hell, which is kind of the prettified version of middle America, but sending it down to hell and doing it in a very playful manner, sometimes darkly playful.
Yeah, definitely. So also your version of Stephen King's The Shining stays faithful to the source material as opposed to Kubrick's adaptation, which King has personally obviously said he favors. So why did you decide to take this approach when you did The Shining?
Because he asked me.
Any ghosts?
I was very naive about it. I thought Kubrick made his version. It's rather well known that King was not happy with it because it was so different from the book. The difference between King and Kubrick is that Kubrick's films are very cold and detached and seen in a clinical sense from the outside in. And King's work is very warm and from the inside out. And so although it seemed like the ultimate creative match, you know, this great American filmmaker and this great American novelist, my God, what a great combination that would be. And indeed, the movie they made became iconic, but the people who'd read the book first realized what was missing from that. So after the huge success we'd had with The Stand, ABC, the television network here in the States, asked King what he would like to do next. And he said, you know, he'd really like to tackle the Shining and see if we could do something that felt a little more true to the book and plumb the depths of the characters in ways that were personal to him when he was writing the book at the time. And King himself wrote the screenplay for the Shining miniseries. And we'd had such success together on The Stand that I was overjoyed when he asked me to, and naive, thinking, well, we're going forward and doing a faithful version of the book, and never thought about all those Kubrick people who hated me for daring to try to step into the shoes of the Grand Master, which nobody ever tried to do.
Well, it was really good. You did a great job.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
What are your thoughts on Kubrick's version?
When the movie came out, I saw a screening of it a few days beforehand, and I really had that reaction I was talking about. I thought, oh my God, Kubrick and King, this has got to be the home run of the season. It was certainly one of my favorite books of all time, and Kubrick was one of my favorite filmmakers. And like most of the critics in the day, I was crashingly disappointed, even crushingly disappointed. Years later, I accepted that it's a great Kubrick film, but it's not a great translation of Stephen King's book. But it wasn't trying to be a great translation of King's book. So I was able to let that go, as I'm sure King has. But at the time, I was so disappointed because it didn't do what the book had done in ways that affected me very deeply. But he made a movie his way, and it was a huge success and became iconic.
Here's Johnny.
But I had loved the book so much that it took me several years to realize, okay, this is a great Kubrick film. It may not be what I was looking for in an adaptation of Stephen King's great novel, but it's a great Kubrick film, and I can detach the two now. And I wasn't able to when I first saw it.
Sleepwalkers is another amazing film that you've made, and it also just celebrated its 30th anniversary, and it has aged extremely well. So obviously it's a classic and certainly up there with the absolute best King adaptations.
Oh, shucks.
What are your hopes for the project?
I don't know who you are, but I know you're not who you say you are.
Behind the secret is a hunger.
Does it have to be her?
Well, that was my first studio picture as a director, and my last, as it turned out, as most of my work was for television or independent film, things like that. I just hoped to be able to make a film that people would like, that King would like, and that would be a success. And it turned out to be the #1 movie that weekend, but it got terrible reviews. It was treated very much like a gutter horror movie and not at all like a studio prestige release. But it was my first opportunity to work with King, and thrilled beyond belief to be able to collaborate with him, talking on the phone every other day or so, having rewrites that I would suggest a scene, handling a scene in the way the studio was asking in their notes for adjustments. And he would say, no, let me do it. And then the next day if you'll remember fax machines, there'd be a half a dozen pages that were terrific. But it was such a great opportunity to work in that playground and to work with such great actors, but mostly to actually work with Stephen King and really collaborate on this. And, the first time I met him was when he shot his cameo. It was a 2-hour setup, a very rushed scene with Stephen King, Clive Barker, and Tobe Hooper all not only in the same scene, but the same shot. And it was thrilling. And he was so happy with it that he asked me to do the stand afterwards.
I also had the opportunity to speak with Alice back when she was doing Texas Chainsaw. So,
oh, wow.
What was it
She's
like?
So great.
Her? Oh, she's amazing.
Alice is one of my favorite actors I've ever worked with. She's so smart and so dedicated. You know, there are a lot of people at her level of expertise and accomplishment who would have turned up their nose at something like this. But she committed. We read a lot of people for that part, but I knew once I saw her in Ghost Story, she never left my mind. And when this role opened up, I thought of her immediately for this part. There's an exotic quality about her. She's beautiful and sexual and intelligent, and there's something dangerous about her eyes and her accent, just the trace of an accent and all. It just made her so unique and so perfect for this part. And we screened it at a festival in Kansas City for the 30th anniversary, and it was a full theater. And it was just like it was opening night at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. It just played so well. And Alice, again, the veracity that she brought to it, and all of the actors, not playing it comedically or as if it were a gutter film, but they gave it their all as if it were Shakespeare. And Alice, having come from doing Shakespeare, really gave it a real touch of class.
Yeah, she really did. What do you think it is about Sleepwalkers that still has people so intrigued to it and drawn to it?
Well, it's really freaking weird. You know, when you're doing it, you don't notice so much. You have the script, you're committed to doing the best job you can. You get caught up in the minutia of helping design the Sleepwalker characters, what they look like, the location scouting, the casting, all these things. All the words are on the page of the script. And then it's my job to visualize those and how they will be realized. When we were working on it, the head of the studio, a guy named Frank Price, said, well, there's not going to be a film Columbia releases with a boy having sex with his mother as long as I'm head of the studio. Well, halfway into the production, he got fired. So he was right. But even watching it 30 years later with the audience, there wasn't a horror movie or any movie like this I could think of when we made it. And it really feels like there hasn't been one since in those preceding 30 years. And I think there's just a uniqueness that obviously the incest element, but also the creation of virginal soul-sucking vampires that feed one another sexually, mother to son, son to mother. I think that's a concept that has yet to be replicated.
That's very true.
Come, we fly.
Switching over now, this is a pretty big deal for me. You helped write the penultimate children's, really started the introduction to horror, Hocus Pocus. Obviously, it's pretty much a movie that captivates Halloween within itself. Tell us about that experience. Basically, tell us everything.
Well, how amazing is that to have done something? You know, I wrote the film 8 years before it was made. And in those 8 years, there were 11 other writers on it after me. But they went back to what I had done for the most part. Although the kids in my draft were 12 years old, they were made 16 years old by the time the movie was made. But other than that, the structure was very much the same. The producer, David Kirshner, had come up with the story idea, and then we worked together on that. And then I wrote the first 2 or 3 drafts of the movie. And nobody ever imagined that it was going to get made. It took so long. But when Bette Midler committed to it, she was at the height of her movie stardom. And so she'd been doing very successful rom-coms and dramas like Beaches, and she'd been doing these comedies and just huge movie star at the time. And when she committed to it, suddenly the green light happened, and we'd been on a flashing yellow light for 8 years. So I was only on the set one day when they were flying on their broomsticks outside the Mill House, the Sanderson house. And that was thrilling because I was still new at what I was doing. And it was produced the same year as Sleepwalkers, but came out the next year. So things were still relatively new for me as a filmmaker, and to have written something and created characters, helped to create characters and situations that the film was mildly successful in its day. It didn't make money, but it didn't lose money. But every year since, it's just gotten more and more popular. And then it started playing on ABC and on the Disney Channel and Disney Plus now. And every year, Freeform would play it for 24 hours on Halloween Day, playing it every single day in the month of October. And suddenly I go, it's Halloween night every year, and I see little tiny Sanderson sisters and little Billy Butchersons and trick-or-treating and everything, and going into the local Halloween shops and seeing all these costumes and toys and merchandise and everything with these creatures that I had a hand in creating. It's pretty amazing.
Jump back. Twist the bones and bend the back. Here to decapitate American mystic. Trim him of his baby fat. Here to decapitate American mystic. Give him fur black as black, just black.
Well, there's been talk of a sequel for probably 10 or 15 years. Originally, they were talking about young Sanderson sisters, either a prequel or their children, or who knows what. But every year it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And the idea of them not doing it seemed silly. And finally, they wised up and said, no, the only way to make this work is by getting the original cast, to get Bette Midler and Kathy Najimy and Sarah Jessica Parker. And that's the only way to really give it its due. I'm not involved in the sequel other than them having created the characters and situations that are involved. But I'm hoping for the best, and I think the time is right now. And especially, it's a female screenwriter, it's a female director, and I think it's a great perspective to do a sequel from.
And you also have a podcast. Tell us about it.
Well, Postmortem was originally a TV show for FearNet. We did 10 episodes where I interviewed everybody from Wes Craven to John Carpenter to William Friedkin to really great people in the horror genre. And that ran for 10 episodes. And then my podcast producer, Joe Russo, was at a party with somebody who worked for Podcast One, and they were the biggest producers of podcasts in the world. And he talked to this guy about the possibility of me turning that into a podcast. So they called me in, met with the head of the company, Norm Pattis, and they were pitching me on it. And so I said, well, it sounds like fun. Let's do it. The reason I do it, and we're in our 6th season now, is because I learned something from every single one of the people I interview. And we've done over 100 interviews. It's on every week, but the interviews are every other week. And then the alternating weeks in between are what we call AMA, Ask Mick Anything, where people in the audience ask questions of me about things I've done over my career or opinions, things like that. But the interviews have been Stephen King and John Carpenter and Guillermo del Toro and Whoopi Goldberg and, just everybody you can think of within the genre and even borderline. We've just had some amazing shows, guests that nobody else has ever had. And it's because of relationships, but also because it's a filmmaker hosting an interview show rather than a journalist. And it comes from a different perspective. And so it's unique, and people we're able to make them feel comfortable because, we're talking about the industry from the inside out.
Postmortem is really cool because, like you mentioned, you did have the series before, and you've talked to obviously heavyweights in the horror industry, as you are as well. So that's my next question for you. So when you created Masters of Horror, was it then that you also realized that you're a part of that list as well?
Well, I never consider myself part of that list, but what was interesting was I started a series of dinners a few years before Masters of Horror ever came to be. And it was just getting horror filmmakers together, people who had a similar job, worked in a similar field. It's like, but we don't talk shop necessarily. It's just a social thing. But we started talking about how difficult it was to create work of our own and not have it completely obliterated by the networks and by the studios and by the distributors and by advertisers. And so I came up with a concept of the lunatics running the asylum, where the filmmakers could do whatever they wanted as long as they did it on budget and on schedule. And we sold the series that way, saying you can get John Carpenter and Tobe Hooper and all of these people will do episodes if you commit to doing the show our way. And we pitched it to 3 different places. They all wanted to do it, but the first one we pitched it to in the room said, how much and when can you start? And we were off and running. So the idea was always the best in the field. And because I had put it together, even though it was on the strength of all these great people that were marquee names, people started referring it to as Mick Garris's Masters of Horror. And so I kind of became a master by default, by bringing them together. And then, we all managed to do work of our own that we wanted to do and pretty much unimpeded. So, it was my football.